Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Tin Man Score channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor, and today I'll be reacting to my third and final Midnight Tales video for you guys. This was called 4 Disturbing True Winter Horror Stories. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn these lights off, move the camera up here for you guys, and let's get this reaction on the road in the bag. Okay, here we go.
A few years ago, I was driving home from a work trip in northern Minnesota. It was the middle of January, and a snowstorm had hit harder than expected. The highways were mostly clear, but the smaller roads were a mess of ice and slush. I had planned to make it home that night, but as the storm worsened, I knew I wouldn't be able to push through. I decided to find a motel, but the next town was still about 40 miles away, and there wasn't much between me and it besides empty road and thick forest. It was around 9 p.m. when I saw the car on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just another stranded vehicle, abandoned until the storm cleared. But as I got closer, my headlights flashed over movement. Someone was inside. I slowed down, debating whether or not to stop. It was freezing, and if someone was stranded, they might need help. But something about the way the car was positioned, angled awkwardly off the road, its hazard lights off, gave me a bad feeling.
Yeah, they had hazard lights on and they were stuck like in a ditch or something. Yeah, I'll try to do something to help them, but if it's parked weird, like he's saying, without no hazard lights on, I hate to be rude, but I would keep on going and call cops to see if they could go investigate it themselves.
Still, I couldn't just leave someone out there in that kind of cold. I pulled up next to the car and rolled down my window. "You all right in there?" At first, no response. Then, after a few seconds, the driver's side door creaked open. A man stepped out, moving slowly like he was stiff from sitting too long. He was tall and thin, wearing only a hoodie and jeans, which immediately struck me as wrong. It was well below freezing, and he didn't even have gloves. His face was pale, his eyes slightly sunken, and something about the way he looked at me made my stomach knot. Not desperate, not relieved, just blank. I forced a friendly tone. "You stuck? Need a ride?" He nodded, but didn't speak. That hesitation should have been my cue to leave, but I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he was just freezing, too cold to talk properly. I unlocked the passenger door. The moment he got in, I regretted it. The smell hit me first. Not alcohol, not sweat. Something stale, like clothes that had been damp for too long. He settled into the seat without adjusting it, without rubbing his hands together for warmth. Just sat there, stiff and still, staring straight ahead. I tried to shake off the unease as I pulled back onto the road. "Where you headed?" He was quiet for an uncomfortably long time. Then, finally, in a low, flat voice, he said, "Town." No town name, no explanation. The snow was coming down heavier now, and the road felt slick under my tires.
Yeah, if I see a sign that says the next town and how many miles it is to get there, I'll be taking him there. Because if he's describing a stale stench, I don't want him in my car either.
I glanced at him again, trying to make sense of the situation. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching slightly. I noticed then that his clothes weren't just thin, they were dirty, like he'd been wearing them for days. Something was off. I kept driving, trying to ignore the tension in my chest. I had about 30 miles to go before the next town. I could drop him off at a gas station and be done with it. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke again. "You drive this way often?" The way he said it, slow and deliberate, sent a chill through me. I forced a short laugh. "Not really, just passing through." He nodded slightly, still staring ahead. "Not many people out tonight." I didn't respond. We drove in silence for another few minutes before he shifted in his seat. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him turn slightly toward me. "You live around here?" I gripped the wheel tighter. Every instinct in me screamed that this was not normal small talk. He wasn't trying to pass the time. He was fishing. "Just visiting family," I lied. "They're expecting me soon." The air in the car felt heavier. He didn't respond, just went back to staring at the road. My heart pounded as I realized how stupid I had been to let a stranger into my car without thinking. I needed to get to town, fast. The next 15 miles felt endless. The snowfall thickened, and I had to focus hard to keep from sliding. My passenger didn't move, didn't shift in his seat or adjust his clothing like a normal person would after coming in from the cold. He just sat there, breathing slow and steady. Then, as we neared the edge of town, he suddenly leaned forward. "You can drop me off here." I glanced at him. We weren't near anything, just a stretch of road leading into town, no houses, no streetlights. I hesitated. "You sure? There's a gas station up ahead." His head snapped toward me. "Here." My stomach twisted. I didn't argue. I pulled over, trying to keep my hands steady as I unlocked the doors.
Yeah, if the guy say he wants to be let out at a certain spot, don't argue with him. Just let him go and be on his way. I know you'll be glad to get him out of your car.
He didn't move right away. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to leave. Then, without a word, he opened the door and stepped out. He stood there, watching as I put the car into drive. I forced myself to nod, to act normal. "Stay warm." He didn't respond. As soon as the door shut, I drove. Faster than I should have on icy roads, but I didn't care. My hands were shaking. Something about that man had been wrong, and I didn't want to think about what would have happened if the storm had been worse, if I had broken down, if there hadn't been a town nearby. When I finally reached a gas station, I pulled in and sat there, catching my breath. My car smelled like him now, like stale, unwashed fabric and something else I couldn't place. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a drifter, someone down on his luck. But then, as I got out to fill my tank, I noticed something. The passenger door handle. It was smeared with something dark, something that looked like dried blood. I left immediately. I didn't report it. I didn't even want to think about it. I just got in my car and drove.
Man, you should have reported because you never know if that guy might have just murdered somebody and left blood on his hand.
Putting as much distance between me and that road as possible. I still don't know who he was, or what he was doing out there with no coat, no gloves, in the middle of nowhere. I don't know why he didn't want to be dropped off in town, or why my car smelled like someone who had been sleeping in it for days. But I do know one thing. I will never, ever pick up another hitchhiker.
After hearing this story, I don't know if I would either. But anyway, yeah, if he had blood on his hand, he probably murdered somebody. Or maybe he could have had problems where he coughed and had blood coming up from his throat. I mean, that's one possibility, but him being in the car with just jeans and no gloves and he had a hoodie, yeah, that tells you he might have been a homeless person that might have been on weird drugs. You never know.
A couple of winters ago, I took a solo trip up to a rental cabin in northern Wisconsin. I had just gone through a messy breakup, and I wanted to clear my head. The plan was simple. 3 days of silence. No phone, no internet. Just me, my books, and the quiet of the woods. I had found the place through an online listing. A little one-bedroom cabin deep in the forest, supposedly owned by an older couple who rented it out during the off-season. The pictures looked nice enough, and the price was cheap. Too cheap, really, but I figured that was because no one wanted to be out there in the dead of winter. The drive up was uneventful. It had snowed the night before, so the roads were slick, and the trees on either side of the highway sagged under the weight of the ice. After turning off the main road, it was another 20 minutes down a narrow, winding path that barely looked maintained. My tires crunched through the snow as I passed empty cabins and darkened houses. I kept expecting to see another car or some sign of life, but there was nothing. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. It looked just like the pictures, small, rustic, with a tiny front porch and a woodpile stacked neatly by the door.
Hey, sounds like one solitary place to clear your mind. And if you don't see anybody else up there, it'll be a little strange, but hey, you won't have to interfere with any neighbors or anybody that ain't supposed to be there. Let's just put it that way.
I parked, grabbed my bag, and made my way inside. It was colder than I expected, but that was normal for places like this. The inside was basic, just a main room with a couch and a wood stove, a little kitchen, and a bedroom off to the side. There were no decorations, no personal touches, just the bare essentials. It felt like no one had been there in a long time. I settled in quickly, lighting a fire and heating up some canned soup. The quiet was almost too much at first. I'm used to the hum of the city, the distant sound of traffic, the occasional siren. Here, there was nothing, just the wind against the trees and the creaking of the cabin as it adjusted to the cold. It should have been peaceful, but something about it made my skin crawl. The first night was fine, mostly. I read for a while, then turned in early. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up feeling like something was off. It took me a second to realize what it was. The cabin wasn't completely silent anymore. There was a sound, a soft rhythmic creaking, like something swaying back and forth. At first, I thought it was the trees outside shifting in the wind. But as I lay there, barely breathing, I realized it was coming from inside the cabin,
Oh, somebody just already broke into your cabin.
from the main room. I told myself it was just the old wood settling, but my body refused to relax. I listened for a long time before finally working up the courage to sit up and peek through the doorway. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the floor, and for a second, I thought I saw something shift near the window. Nothing else happened that night, but I barely slept. The next morning, I decided to go for a short walk to clear my head. The woods around the cabin were dense, but there was an old trail leading deeper into the trees. The air was crisp, my boots sinking into the untouched snow as I walked. It should have been relaxing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned back sooner than I planned, and as I came around the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The woodpile by the door looked different. When I arrived, it had been stacked neatly. Now, some of the logs had been shifted, like someone had taken a few and hastily put them back. I hadn't touched them. I tried to brush it off. Maybe an animal had knocked them over. Maybe I just hadn't been paying attention. But my gut told me otherwise. That night, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle just in case. I felt stupid, but I didn't care. The fire burned warm, and for a while, I let myself relax. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The creaking. This time, I knew exactly where it was coming from. The front porch. It was slow and deliberate, the sound of wood flexing under weight. Someone was out there. I sat frozen, my breath caught in my throat. There was no reason for anyone to be here. The nearest cabin was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. I hadn't expected one, but now it felt like a mistake. The creaking stopped. For the next hour, I sat in silence, every muscle in my body locked in place, listening. There were no footsteps, no retreating sounds, nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the fire had burned out, and pale morning light was creeping through the curtains. Everything looked normal. No footprints outside, no sign that anyone had been there. But when I went to boil water for coffee, I noticed something that made my stomach drop.
What?
The kitchen window was unlocked. I was sure I had checked it the night before. I packed my things and left within the hour. I didn't even bother cleaning up.
Hey, I don't blame him. I'll be packing up too and getting out of there because if I keep hearing weird noises, it sounds like somebody's trying to come in. I'll be like, cabin's yours. I'm out of here.
The drive back to town felt longer than before, the trees pressing in on either side of the road. When I finally got a signal, I pulled over and checked the listing. It was still there, same photos, same cheap price. But the contact information was gone. No name, no phone number, just a blank space where the details should have been. I still don't know who was out there with me. Maybe it was just a squatter looking for shelter. Maybe someone had been using the cabin without the owner knowing. But there was one thing that stuck with me. When I got home, I checked my reservation email again, scanning through the details. And that's when I saw the address. It was one number off from the cabin I had actually stayed in. I had spent the weekend in the wrong cabin, and someone else had been there with me.
How in the world did you mix up the two cabins? I mean, that is so odd. I mean, I've been calling the person that was renting out the cabins and be like, somebody else is supposed to be staying in this cabin too, because I keep hearing weird noises. And if he tells you the number that you're supposed to be in, and be like, oh, yeah, I'll move to the other one. Well, you should have read it finally and be like, all right, this is the one I'm going to, and the other one belongs to somebody else. Okay.
Three years ago, I took a job doing delivery runs for a local supply company in northern Idaho. It wasn't anything glamorous, mostly hauling food, propane, and basic supplies to remote cabins and lodges that were snowed in for the season. The work could be brutal, long stretches of empty road in the dead of winter, with nothing but my radio and the occasional snowplow to break the silence. Most of the places I delivered to were owned by people who had either gone south for the winter or were living off-grid, which meant I rarely saw anyone. One afternoon in late January, my dispatcher sent me out on a run to a property about 40 miles from town. The order was a little strange, not the usual bulk supplies, just a few bags of food, a couple of propane canisters, and some medical supplies. The name on the order didn't ring a bell, and when I checked our delivery records, I realized we had never serviced this address before. That wasn't unheard of, but most of our regulars placed orders every few weeks. A one-time delivery in the middle of winter stood out. I left town around 3 p.m., figuring I could get there before dark if I didn't waste time. The first part of the drive was uneventful, just miles of snowy road cutting through thick pine forest. As I got closer, the route became rougher, the snow deeper. Eventually, the plowed road ended, and I had to switch to four-wheel drive. According to the GPS, I had about 5 miles left. The further I went, the worse the conditions got. The road was barely more than a trail, twisting through dense trees, the kind of place you wouldn't find unless you were looking for it.
Yeah, I actually kind of feel bad for the people that live in the far boony countryside or in the mountains during a winter storm because they would probably don't have any firewood or propane to heat up their house. So I'm glad that he's doing something to help them out.
The strangest part was how untouched it looked. Most of the cabins I delivered to had signs of life. Tracks in the snow, smoke from a chimney, something to let you know people were there. This place? Nothing. Finally, I reached the address. It wasn't a proper house, just a small hunting cabin set back from the road. No lights, no movement. The place looked abandoned, half buried in snow, with drifts piled high against the walls.
Now, something like this, yes, I could see people need a propane for because if they don't have no electricity on a small cabin like that, they're going to need something to warm up quick. But yeah, something is fishy by the way he's describing that already. You need to be on the lookout. There might be some crazy people in there.
I parked and honked twice, waiting. No answer. I grabbed the supplies, walked up the short path to the front door, and knocked. The wood was ice cold under my knuckles. After a few seconds, I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. At this point, I was starting to get annoyed. The order had been placed under someone's name. Someone had to be expecting me. I tried the door. It was unlocked. I stepped inside, just far enough to call out. "Hello? Delivery?" Silence. The cabin was freezing, colder than it should have been if someone had been staying there. A wood stove sat in the corner, but there was no fire, no warmth, just the stale smell of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. I set the bags down near the door, my breath clouding in the dim light. That's when I saw the chair. It was in the center of the small room, facing the door. A heavy wooden thing, worn from use. The odd part was the rope hanging loosely around the armrests and legs, as if someone had been tied there and managed to get free. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. This wasn't right. I turned to leave, but just as I stepped back outside, I saw something that made my stomach twist. My truck. The driver's side door was open. I knew for a fact I had shut it. I always did. The wind wasn't strong enough to have blown it open, and even if it had, why just the driver's side? The passenger door was still shut tight. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to walk, trying not to look as panicked as I felt. The cab was empty. Nothing inside had been touched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there. I got in, locked the doors, and backed out onto the road, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel.
I'll be looking behind my seats and everything because you never know if somebody could have opened the door and snuck in there. This guy needs to be careful.
I didn't care about the delivery anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove, my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe I had left the door open by mistake. Maybe the ropes on the chair were for something innocent. But deep down, I knew better. That order had been placed for someone who should have been there. I made it back to town just after dark and went straight to the dispatch office. My supervisor was still there, so I told him everything. He frowned and checked the order logs, then shook his head. There's no record of that address in our system. I felt my blood run cold. What do you mean? You sent me out there. He turned the screen so I could see for myself. The order wasn't there. No name, no delivery request, nothing. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called the sheriff's department and told them what had happened. They sent a deputy out to check the property, but when he called me back later, he sounded confused. "There's no one out there," he said. "The place looks like it hasn't been used in years." I asked him about the chair, the ropes, my truck door. All I can tell you is, if someone was out there, they aren't anymore. I quit the job 2 weeks later. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see, that I had been lured there for a reason, and I still don't know what would have happened if I had arrived a little earlier.
That is fishy. So they probably canceled the order while he was en route there, just so wouldn't have no evidence of it, and took all the stuff that he dropped there and made it look like nobody's lived there. But yeah, that would baffle me. I'll be thinking, did a ghost send me out here or what?
I used to work as a nighttime security guard for a small office building in upstate New York. It wasn't a high-stakes job, mostly just watching cameras, making sure no one was messing around in the parking lot, and locking up if anyone forgot. The building was on the edge of town, right next to a wooded area, and in the winter, it got eerily quiet. Most of the businesses inside closed by 6 p.m., so after that, I was usually the only person there. One night, during a particularly bad snowstorm, I was scheduled for an overnight shift. The roads were a mess, and only a few cars were left in the lot, probably belonging to people who decided to wait out the storm instead of risking the drive home. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and every so often, the power flickered. I had my little space heater plugged in at the desk, a thermos of coffee, and my phone to keep me company. Around 11 p.m., I started my usual rounds. The building had 2 floors, with most of the offices on the upper level and a break room near the back. The lower level was mostly storage and maintenance rooms, plus the main entrance with a big glass foyer. Everything was quiet, just the hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the old pipes. When I reached the front lobby, I glanced out the windows to check the parking lot. That's when I saw him. A man standing just beyond the glow of the street lamp, at the edge of the lot near the tree line. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a sweater and jeans, and his head was slightly tilted like he was listening for something.
First of all, doing a security guard job, just looking at the computer screen sounds fun, at least to me. But yeah, if I see somebody that's just standing out in the middle of the parking lot and I know they don't work there, I'll be going out there to see what he wants.
The snow was coming down hard, but he didn't move, didn't seem to be shivering or reacting to the cold at all. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe he was someone from one of the offices waiting for a ride, but something about the way he stood there, so still, so focused on the building, made my stomach knot. I reached for the radio clipped to my belt and cleared my throat. Hey, anyone still here? Silence. The front doors were locked, but I still didn't like the idea of this guy standing out there. I knocked on the glass, hoping he'd wave or do something normal, like signal that he needed help. Instead, he just took a step forward, not toward the entrance, not toward the street, just closer to the building. I stepped back instinctively. Something about the way he moved was unnatural, slow and deliberate, like he was testing how close he could get. The snow around him was undisturbed, which didn't make sense. He had to have walked there, but there were no footprints behind him. I didn't want to stand there any longer. I hurried back to the security desk and checked the cameras, switching through the angles as fast as I could. The feed for the parking lot flickered for a second before loading. He wasn't there. I sat frozen, staring at the screen. There was no way he could have moved that fast. I had only been gone for a few seconds. My gut told me to check the lobby again, to confirm with my own eyes that he was gone. But another part of me, the part screaming that something was very wrong, kept me rooted to my seat. Then the motion sensor alert chimed. I swallowed hard and clicked on the alert. The camera covering the second floor hallway had detected movement. That didn't make sense. I hadn't heard the door open. The building was locked. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. But as the video feed loaded, my blood turned to ice. A shape was standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the emergency exit light. I couldn't make out his face, but I knew it was the same man. He was standing perfectly still, just like before, his head slightly tilted, watching. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might throw up. I reached for my phone to call the police, but my hands were shaking too much to type. When I finally managed to dial, the call wouldn't go through. No signal. The power flickered again, and for a split second, every camera feed cut out. When they came back, the hallway was empty. I stood up so fast, my chair tipped over. I didn't care if it made me look stupid. I grabbed my keys, threw on my coat, and bolted for the side exit. Snow and wind blasted me in the face, but I didn't stop. I sprinted through the parking lot to my car, barely fumbling my keys into the ignition. The engine groaned in protest from the cold before finally turning over. I didn't look back. I called my supervisor from a gas station a few miles away. He was annoyed at first, but when I told him what happened, his tone changed. He told me to stay put, and that he'd send someone else to check the building. The next morning, he called me back. There was no one in the building, he said. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing. But, he hesitated. But what? They found something near the second floor emergency exit. I gripped my phone tighter. What was it? Bare footprints, he said, in the snow, leading up to the door. I never went back after that. I quit the next week. They hired someone else to take my place, and as far as I know, nothing weird has happened since. But every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I think about that night, and I wonder if he's still out there.
Yeah, that would completely baffle me because I'll be wondering what does that guy want, and how in the world was he able to go from one place to another place of the building on another camera quick, unless he was able to run. But if he's barefooted, oh man, he would probably slip. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those post notifications for more Midnight Tales reactions. This has been another successful installment of the Tin Man Squirrel channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor. I say that's a wrap, and have a nice day, y'all.